Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast, where we talk to foresters about how they are using digital technologies in their day-to-day forestry work. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Digital Forester Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Cassidy Rankine. He's the Western Canadian Account Executive with Planet. So for all those people who are interested in EO or Earth observation, this is the man. He's got a Ph.D. in Earth observation from the University of Alberta. He's been around. Many of you already know him. He's done some awesome kick-ass work in the space. Cassidy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really good. Yeah, excited to be here.
Awesome. And where are we reaching you? Because nowadays, we really don't know. We're both rocking the virtual background for our YouTube viewers, for our listeners. You know, we got forestry backgrounds going on, but where are you calling in from?
So I am in a pretty heavy, forestry industry-centric place in British Columbia. I'm in Vernon, BC.
Nice. How's the skiing out in that neck of the woods? You guys, I heard, have a good base of snow for winter.
Yeah, better than last year for sure. We've got not super fresh snow, but I think we've got some coming this weekend. I've got a new snowboard and I'm going out on Friday.
Nice. I'm jealous. I haven't gone out for the season at all, but our mountains are your ski hills or garbage dumps, I believe. Like, you have the real stuff out there. But before we got going, our listeners are probably going to laugh because we were being on back-to-back calls and we're just trying to get back in stride. So I think a lot of folks can appreciate in these days it's kind of one Zoom or Teams call after another. But I'm really excited to chat with you today because I've had a couple podcasts interviews already, and this Earth observation thing, climate tech space, and all this stuff, like, it's really coming together. And I know you're going to represent and be able to bring us all the latest and greatest. But before we get into that, tell me how you got into forestry. I think there's some really cool academic side things of the story, and then industry, school, obviously. But for our listeners, why don't you introduce yourself and how you got into the space?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do that. So, and this is good timing. I actually just came off a meeting that was very much like the future of forestry at Planet. So I'm all jazzed up around, what's going on in forestry and remote sensing.
Nice.
And couldn't be better timing. But yeah, I wouldn't consider myself a forester, but I do work a lot in forestry. I have a background, an academic background in forest ecology and forest successional studies, so looking at how forests grow back over time. But going way back, actually my roots had me growing up in British Columbia. I fell in love with forests, actually very close to where I'm living now in Vernon, BC, in the Shuswaps. My family's had property out there for forever. Basically, from the time I was 6 months old, I grew up out on the lake in the forests, beautiful temperate forests up there, a lot of Douglas fir and hemlock. And it's one of the last remaining pockets of old growth, temperate interior rainforest in British Columbia. And so that really had a strong influence on why I went into forest studies and ecology and biology. And so really that love and passion for forest came from a very young age. And it's nice to be back in the place where it kind of all started. But I did my undergraduate at the U of A in biology. A lot of the studies were evolutionary biology, ecology, and conservation biology, and ended up going into a grad studies program in earth and atmospheric science, actually looking at forest regeneration using all sorts of fun new gadgets like what's now known as IoT, so internet connected sensors, looking at forest health and ecology from an in situ on ground measurement standpoint, and trying to figure out how to measure that from space, and how to correlate those variables on how forest recovery looks from a satellite image or a satellite sensor. And I actually spent the last 8 or 9 years working more in industry, in the startup world, around forest inventories, LiDAR, all sorts of different remote sensing technology. And so now I consider myself a naturalist, but with an expertise in forest remote sensing and monitoring.
Yeah, for sure. I always love our guests on this podcast because everybody's just so humble in terms of what they've done. And again, I've seen your CV again, undergrad straight into a PhD, and enough when we see that, that's often a signal, like, bright minds, the next wave coming, lots of ideas. I'm just curious before we kind of dig in. are you where you thought you'd be? Because again, you and I both did grad school, right? And we kind of had a foot in industry, a bit of academia, obviously curious people. But you and I both, I obviously joke, at least for myself, I say I went to the dark side. I didn't go into the ivory towers. But did you kind of always know you were going to kind of come out of the academic route, or is it still something as you're going through it, like not sure?
No, I would definitely say I had no idea when I was in university where it would take me. I just was so interested in anything related to science and technology. I was always torn actually between doing like a business program or like a science business program that the U of A has. And I, at the time, in my undergrad, thought I might go into marine biology. I did some fun work out at the Bamfield Marine Science Center, field courses, and I thought for sure oceanography and marine sciences. And that took a quick left turn when I got an NSERC, so Canadian Federal Research Grant as a student to work for a lab called the Center for Earth Observation Science at the U of A to go and install weather stations in Brazil. And that took me down the path I'm on today, which was, environmental instrumentation, forest ecology and monitoring. I mean, I just wanted to travel. I wanted to go to Brazil.
For
And that
sure,
turned
for
into a
sure.
long track record of traveling all over the world, doing forestry instrumentation and radiometric monitoring, and took me where I am today.
Yeah, so thinking of our global listeners, U of A, University of Alberta in Edmonton. So in Brazil, does that mean you're fluent in Portuguese?
Eu falo português. So it's Portuguese English mix. The funny part of that is I actually learned Portuguese working in what would be considered like backwater redneck parts of Brazil.
Yeah.
So I learned Portuguese from like the forest rangers, and these individuals don't necessarily have formal education backgrounds, so they speak a very rough form of Portuguese that I am told is almost like a hillbilly version.
That's awesome. So for our Brazilian listeners, hopefully what Cassidy said makes sense, and or you're on the ground howling in laughter, and that's cool too. So for our listeners, like I'm curious to learn as well, some buzzwords like neon, other things, scaling up, and maybe tell our listeners more about that PhD research, because often uh, we kind of shrug it off, but it was a large part of your life, like 6 years research,
Yeah.
obviously travel. But for our listeners who, before we dive into the commercial forestry side of things, or maybe the applications more on the science side, maybe kind of educate our listeners and myself truthfully what was happening in that research, what you're really trying to answer in terms of some of your science questions.
Yeah, it's a dangerous question because I could probably talk for way too long on that. But in short, we were really trying to understand how essential climate variables, which are, or ECVs for short, which are becoming more and more kind of a popular reference for environmental, social governance industry, how these variables that are biophysical variables, so like tree volumes and biomass and things like the humidity levels in a forest or the soil organic content, all of this is related to the temperature and moisture dynamics in a forest. And when fields, or when forests in the tropics, which is where I started doing my PhD research, which led to more temperate forestry research, when they get cleared for agriculture, there's a lot of unknowns in what happens as they grow back over time, and how do the services and environmental value provided by forest return over time. So that's things like the timber itself, which is easy to think of, trees and timber, but also, water storage and carbon storage and biodiversity, fruits and nuts, all of the raw materials that a lot of, First Nations and Indigenous peoples rely on that live in these forest adjacent communities. And really in a 10, 20, 30, 40-year cycle, when agricultural fields are left to fallow and essentially recover some of that organic soil materials, there's not a lot of knowledge on, the trees grow back, but do the birds come back? Do the insects come back? Do we get the fruit producing trees? Or is it just kind of scrubland that doesn't have a lot of social or environmental value. And so we wanted to be able to measure that at scale using satellites. So at the time it was MODIS, the moderate resolution imaging spectroradiometer system on NASA's Aqua and Terra satellites. They're very coarse spatial resolution by today's standards, so 250 meter pixels, 500 meter and 1 kilometer pixels, measuring attributes like leaf area and absorbed photosynthetic radiation, because those are variables that correlate very nicely with how much carbon is being pulled into the forest and stored in the wood and the soil and the stems. And there was not an easy way to tell how accurate that was. So my job was to go in and put as many sensors, light sensors, photosynthetic radiation sensors, soil moisture sensors, temperature, wind, all of the variables that relate to the redevelopment of environmental services that forests provide, and validate how accurately the satellites measure that, and see if we could estimate that at a larger landscape level across the tropics. And that eventually turned into research collaborations with a number of global institutions looking at very similar things in very different landscapes around the world. So from northern Alberta, looking at those aspen forests and how those recover over time from forestry activities, all the way down to the eucalyptus forests in Australia, where we worked with their terrestrial ecological monitoring network of carbon flux towers to see how eucalyptus forests were handling the extreme drought of climate change. And it really turned into a much more global project around forest health and regeneration than was originally intended. But it was an exciting team and research group to be part of.
Yeah, very cool. And a lot of that output, I believe, adopted by, you mentioned Australia, CSIRO, and, German space, DLR and stuff. So that's cool to see the science go out there and be applied. So we're going to dive into some topics maybe. So every forester, well, maybe I should say every forester loves drones, but every forester has either seen one or used one, or really it's part of the toolkit, I would argue. Skymatics, you're a co-founder, CTO there, I believe. Tell me more about that. How was that just a progression from, the academic research, sensors, drones, and different scales? How did that come to be, and what was the key things you were doing there in that company?
Yeah, I would say it was an evolution of the research I was doing, which was really trying to understand how spectral signals can relate to those biophysical attributes of vegetation, and that's function and structure of vegetation. And what was happening in the early 2010s was drone technology was coming from transitioning from a hobby, kind of a DIY, build your own system, into the first commercially available drones, from DJI with their original Phantoms and putting cameras built onto them. So I think it was 2012 when we got our hands on kind of a novice ready unmanned area vehicle system. And we tried to figure out, how do we bridge the gap between those point measurements we're making in the forest? So if you think of inventory for forestry today, you've got your plots and you're trying to scale that up to LiDAR-based measurements, et cetera. We were doing that in forestry as well, from a research and landscape ecophysiology monitoring dynamics, taking point measurements and scaling them up to very large pixels from satellites. And there's that huge scaling gap from a 200-some meter pixel to maybe a 1 hectare footprint sensor measurement of carbon flux. The drones came in right at a time that it was becoming apparent that, wow, we could actually collect very, very high resolution imagery over our study sites and start to do things like individual tree counts and crown measurements, and understand how much understory vegetation was there from very near surface remote sensing, so drones, and then scaling the information in those high resolution pixels out to the time series measurements we're making on the ground, and then up to the time series information from satellites. And so I just fell in love with drones. I mean, if anyone who has flown a drone for the first time can remember the feeling of grabbing that controller and just, having the thing on your fingertips, almost like a real life video game. they're
Yeah, for
very
sure.
fun to fly. So
Yep. Yep.
I
They're
started
slightly
using them a lot.
addictive.
They are addictive, and I found all the ways to use them the right way and the wrong way.
For
But
sure.
I ended up co-founding Skymatics to learn how to use drones essentially for industrial applications, commercial applications, forestry, agriculture, mining, you name it, all the things they're used for today. We were one of the first companies in Canada to get a commercial permit to actually operate these things. And it was a cool opportunity to apply all my academic knowledge on spectral analysis and make some money solving industry problems.
Yeah, absolutely. The best of all worlds there. So thinking of some of our listeners who may not fully be into that drone space or are thinking about going there. And again, I know you kind of moved on from that space, but are there any pro tips you would give our listeners? Does it really matter what you buy? Is it still going to a Best Buy or a store, and what's consumer available is good enough, or is there some things you kind of picked up from that experience that you'd say, if I look back to a younger Cassidy, I would tell him, it's like, watch out for this. Are there any pro tips you'd share with our listeners?
I would say, I mean, the consumer off the shelf drones, those are the, $500 to $1,500 Best Buy drones, can do a lot more than you'd think. And that's kind of where our business focus was taking the affordable stuff, the stuff that doesn't cost you $20,000, $50,000 to put in the air, and then, you're crossing your fingers that it doesn't crash. What kind of value can you get out of that? So just a simple, true color digital photograph. What kind of information can you extract? Is it object counting? There's a lot of stuff you can do with that. You don't have to necessarily start with the big rigs. And I think that's the cool thing about drones, is it democratizes the remote sensing process. More and more people are understanding what can be done with aerial imagery, what can't be done, what new sensors do we need to measure that next best thing that we want to measure. And so, start small, build up from there, and don't jump into the deep end on the tech stuff. Just focus on what problems can you solve today, lowest cost investment, and build up from there. Once you find a niche that you can do differently, stick with it.
Yeah, for sure. That's great advice. Just get going, or Nike slogan, just do it, try, experiment, and
Yeah.
fail fast, common terms there. So I also know you worked for Tesla Systems, and Bruce is going to be on the show in a couple of weeks, but maybe talk about what you did there, because this is going to bring in LiDAR again. It's still the hot word, forest inventory, area-based predictions, individual tree. And again, you're coming from an EO, like trained as an Earth observation scientist. So I'm curious to see, when you came into that space, started looking at who's who in the zoo and what they're doing, did it match with your scientific training and your industry experience, or was there something where you kind of said, like, oh my God, it's like, why are they doing it this way? It's like, I'm going to flip this on the head and add value there. What can you share on that front in terms of that career journey?
Yeah, good question. And there's definitely a few kind of hot topic areas in how forest inventories are done and the technology that's applied that conflicted with my view of, like, what should we be doing? Here's the art of the possible in the R&D world. Where's the commercial value? What's the low-hanging fruit? How can we incrementally increase the efficiency or the reliability of the information coming out of the types of sensors we're putting on drones and airplanes? And there's some specific examples I could think of that I could bring up that I thought, okay, why are they doing it like that? And then I dig into, okay, well, it's cheaper, but if the information is not giving you what you need, then is it worth, spending less on that? And that's really the struggle when it comes to the R&D side of bringing new technology to industry. Is, first of all, you solve the technical problem, and maybe it's like, how do we analyze a LiDAR point cloud in a totally different way? Maybe it's using neural networks to extract the types of indices that we would normally traditionally calculate in a much more structured, hard-coded way. And trying to understand what are the barriers to adoption in industry. So who's poo-pooing this idea and why? And try to tease that apart. Is it just because they have a method that works and don't mess with a good thing? Is it the fear of the unknown of, we can't trace back a machine learning algorithm's process? So how could we ever convince regulators that this is a reliable approach?
The black box.
The infamous black box.
Yep.
And I learned where to pick my battles and where to say, maybe you could do it this way, and this is why, and try not to make people upset, because forestry has a very deep-rooted, you know, human resource background. You know, there's folks that have just been at it their entire careers. Aerial photography works. Let's not mess with a good thing. And then there's the shakers and the movers that really want to see what the new latest and greatest stuff can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, foresters are sometimes set in their ways. You know, also early adopters of some geospatial technology early on. You know, they're back at it there, but sometimes it's yeah, a challenge. Thinking of that, you're at Planet now, and then so you know we've kind of gone through a bit of your background, and I suspect our listeners are going like, "Wow, you know, there's lots of buzzwords that I've gone through, and this guy knows them. He's using them liberally." You're at Planet now, and obviously in forestry, a lot of forestry companies are using Planet technology, and so and maybe for our listeners who don't know who Planet is, can you maybe pause and introduce who Planet is, what their history is, their vision, their raison d'etre, or whatever that thing is, and then maybe talk about how you ended up there, because I'm even curious to know how that came to be in your new role as an account executive.
Yeah, so Planet's a unique company in the sense that they've really pioneered the use of a CubeSat. You know, they were the first ones to say, why do satellites have to be so big and expensive and risky? They coined the phrase agile aerospace, taking the philosophy from, you know, Silicon Valley, iterate quickly, fail fast, and build on those failures. And they applied it to the concept of Earth observation. Now, there actually is a good podcast, how I built this, that you know, better explains the origins of Planet than I can. That's an interview with our CEO and co-founders, and it really gets into a lot of interesting detail on where the idea came from. But it's basically a small group of, you know, satellite scientists, you know, some from NASA, some from JPL, et cetera, that tried to break the mold on how we got into orbit and measured the Earth. And so Planet is really an aerospace company that is transforming into a data provider. And what we have is the world's largest constellation of Earth observation satellites. You know, I think we've launched over 400 satellites. We've got our kind of core constellation PlanetScope that images the Earth every day. So we've got a photograph of every place on the land surface updated
Amazing.
almost daily. And that enables us to be able to monitor change. And the key kind of concept and philosophy behind Planet is you can't fix what you can't see. And so we've taken this approach to be able to allow anybody and everybody that has interest in monitoring and managing Earth's resources and assets and natural capital, and to be able to access that information more readily through our constellations.
Yeah, so very, very, very cool. So thinking of again, often on this show, I love to role play as the forester who's kind of learning, and in most cases, I am learning new things. But as a forester, it's like, you know, I hear about Cassie other options, you know, like the Sentinels, the Landsats, and but for what I heard from what you just said, it's like your temporal resolution is way higher. But as a forester, it's like, give me the pitch, like what because again we'll talk about what you do now, and then I also know there's other things, directions you're going, and we'll get there, but what's the pitch to the everyday forester now? Is it really about knowing what's happening in your forest, something as simple as that, monitoring, you know, cut block progress, or is it more about vitality or health? And you know, this is where we go into that hyperspectral route. This is more in the multi-spec, I guess. But what's the pitch you find yourself giving most days to a forester who's just learning more about Planet?
Well, you've asked the right guy. I'm the greasy salesman now. But, you know, the account executive role really is a sales heavy focus, which is a big shift for me coming from remote sensing analytics and product development. And I wanted to take a sales role to start to take new technologies that are ready for industry instead of developing those solutions and trying to see them grow into industry. It's like, we've got something that's ready to go. It works. Here's the proof points. It's a new technology, but this is why I think you're ready for it, and really start to see industry change faster. So that's why I went into sales, is I want to get the stuff that I find really exciting, which is this, high temporal resolution Earth observation imagery into the hands of the folks that are using it every day. If we can get people driving to site in less often to reduce their risk and operations, we want to do that. If we can help them keep an eye on their inventories without needing to contract out expensive aerial imagery and update their inventory within season, in a cost-effective way, we want to do that. So I've seen a huge adoption in Western Canada in the forestry industry of our satellite imagery. To be honest, the majority of it is actually not our daily imagery. It's our high resolution 50 centimeter SkySat imagery. And the spot that it's found its way into forestry is to replace or supplement a lot of the aerial surveys.
Okay.
Where a company may invest a huge amount of money to do their, if it's not annual, maybe it's every 2 or 3 years, aerial survey to get their 10 to 30 centimeter imagery for inventory purposes or for operational reasons. And using something like a 50 centimeter satellite image, which is on demand, you literally just press a button, you have control to go take that picture when and where you want it, to update the stuff that is already out of date after their aerial survey. So an example of a company that just purchased some SkySat imagery had invested in a big LiDAR survey this spring in British Columbia. With our record-breaking fire season, I think about 30% of their forestry management area burnt, and their LiDAR information is already out of date in terms of trying to build an area-based analysis.
Yeah.
So they need to supplement and update some of the aerial imagery and understand what areas they may not be able to use that LiDAR point cloud anymore in their analytics. And they're not going to get a contractor with an airplane out there in a timely manner, especially at the very end of the season, or when there's a lot of smoke that prevents you from flying. So the SkySat constellation is basically on demand. You just press a button and a point on a map, and you task the satellite to go collect imagery over that spot. And a lot of forestry companies are getting a lot of value out of the fact that it's readily available, very cost effective, and can keep their monitoring efforts up to date.
Yeah. So for our listeners, when you say push the button, task it to take the photo, is it really that easy? Log on, click the button, or is it really, oh, I got to call Cassidy. This is his way of getting me to give him a call and chat through. Is it that easy?
It is that easy once you're set up on a subscription service. So it's a subscription service, and yes, you do have to reach out to me if you don't have that set up. If you're in Western Canada, or anyone at Planet, if you're outside of this territory, can help you on the sales front. But once you've set up, a service agreement, it is very much designed to put the control back to you. So traditionally for satellite tasking, you have to contact the company and say, I've got this area of interest. I want an image of this specification. Can you provide that, or can you collect it for me? It can take quite a long time for that to turn around. It can be weeks before successful collection, because these sub-meter resolution satellites, there's not a lot of them. Our competitors out there may have less than half a dozen. We've got 21 of these SkySats, and we're adding to the constellation. I think we launch new satellites on average every 3 or 4 months. And so we've got capacity to actually have that image collected when you pick a point on the map on the user dashboard within a few days. It's technically possible to have same day collection if the weather and timing is right. Next day or the day after is kind of the average turnaround we see in most forestry cases. And it's a good size image. It's that minimum capture is 5 by 5 kilometers. So, 25 square kilometers seen, much bigger footprint than an aerial photograph. And a lot of folks like the ability to just get it when they need it on their schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. And hey, man, it's like there's no shame in sales roles. As I've discovered things, I find it, one of the most fascinating careers, in all honesty. It's like, I love it. It's like, we've got the used car salesman stereotypes, but like sales profession is like awesome. It's like hats off to you, and kudos to you for embracing and going down that path. So so for our listeners, we heard of PlanetScope, we've heard SkySat. What else is in the pipe for Planet? And is there anything else you can share in terms of some other use cases that you're seeing foresters adopt regularly, or maybe kind of at that edge where you're trying to guide them into that direction, because what the future could be, and change takes time, but you're kind of nurturing them there. What else can you share about Planet's mission and vision and for the forestry space?
Yeah, Planet's going to keep on building satellites and putting up the next generation of sensors on a regular basis. We launched 44 new Super Doves the week before last, to add to our constellation there of about 200 strong in that PlanetScope constellation. And those are 8 spectral bands. So the nice thing about being able to update the sensors in that constellation every few months is we can get more and more spectral bands added to that constellation. So I think so that includes like a red edge band, which is really helpful for like pest detection and like general stress indicators in tree canopies. There's additional bands in the yellow and coastal blue. So it allows for much more nuanced land cover classification and things like water stress and moisture stress monitoring, pest infestations, earlier detection of diseases. And really, that's kind of something that I'm looking forward to getting into the hands of foresters who may be looking to detect problems earlier than they have been able to. And that's at about a 3-meter resolution pixel. So it's fine enough to not necessarily see an individual tree, but you're going to get a stand with good level of confidence and information. So we're always evolving our spectral capabilities on that near daily monitoring kind of medium resolution solution. And on the horizon, the stuff that I am allowed to talk about is the Pelican constellation. So we're building the next generation SkySat, essentially. SkySats are sub-meter imaging, 4 spectral bands. And that's gonna, don't quote me on this, I believe we're gonna be essentially doubling the resolution of SkySat. So really getting into that sub 50 centimeter domain where aerial imagery really shines, and helping a lot of folks that need to see individual trees or higher spatial resolution. And we're working towards having greater temporal coverage with that constellation. And I think there's a few other interesting developments. I may not be able to speak more in depth other than the fact that we've got a joint project with the JPL, Arizona State University, and a few other groups. That's called Carbon Mapper. That's a hyperspectral 400 spectral band system that will be also using that same Pelican bus, so the satellite bus, to do hyperspectral monitoring of greenhouse gas emissions. And
very cool.
The applications go a lot beyond that, but that's just some of the key areas.
Yeah, well, this is where I feel old, because back in my day, right, it's Landsat and like AVHRR, and it was like multispectral, super spectral, and hyperspectral. I don't even know what jargon's used nowadays in the EO space, but yeah, so definitely same one still going. All right, so maybe I'm not that much of a dinosaur quite yet. So definitely cool to see that direction. And when you say that, breaching, that 50 centimeter range. So what are you thinking? You and others will kill off aerial mapping at some point in time, will negate the need for planes and large format cameras. What are your thoughts on that? Or you think it's just a function of depends on what you're trying to do?
I think very much it's going to be a little column A and a little column B. So we are seeing already replacement of some parts of aerial surveys for forestry, where maybe you're doing the entire land holding or woodlot every couple of years with aerial imagery. Now it might just be some smaller areas of that land base with aerial, and then the rest of it more frequently with satellite. The one advantage aerial still has is that stereo component. So getting those, soft copy models, and there's regulatory requirements for specific resolutions and stereo imagery inventories. So that's really where aerial imagery is gonna shine for at least 5 years to come or more. We are doing stereo satellite work, but you don't get the precision and you don't get that same level of accuracy. We are able to get things like stand height and canopy height from stereo satellites, but specific vegetation subtypes is a little bit more challenging. So I think it's very much a supplementary workflow, similar to how people are using drones where they used to only be able to use aerial imagery. It's kind of like
Right.
that niche scaling. So very small area, medium versus large is when you use the different imaging tools.
Yeah, for sure. No, that's a great comment. And just you answering it that way, right? It signals, this is one of those good account executives who are going to educate and not immediately say, oh, or Planet, we're going to kill everybody, all of their options. It's like, Cassie's going to educate you on what makes sense. Same with the drones, right? I think around 500 hectares, that sweet spot that once you go above, it kind of don't make sense anymore. So definitely thanks for sharing that view. I'm just curious, when you said you guys pushed 40 of these doves up, and I'm just curious, like internally at the company, when that day is coming, I assume there's some nerves. Like what's it like in the company when you're hitting that milestone? Like I'm sure there's a celebration after they get up successfully, but until you get to that point, what's it like in the organization? Is it kind of pins and needles? I'm just curious.
A little bit, and I would say less pins and needles for the newbies like myself. So I'm just 6 months into the company. This was 2 weeks ago, it was my first launch I took part of. And we do a traditional pancake breakfast. So there's a headquarters in San Francisco. They usually do that in person, but with the pandemic, that's been pushed remote. So they actually sent all of us our own pancake kits.
Nice. Nice.
We got aprons, etc. It's traditional to do that, but then everybody kind of huddles and watches the launch nervously because we have lost payloads in the past. We've had, I can't remember, it was earlier in the days, but lost a pretty significant number of satellites. Luckily, you spread that risk out across a number of launches, and we've had quite a few launches more successful than not. But in watching the launch 2 weeks ago, we've got the CEO, Will Marshall, on the screen, and you could see the nerves. You could see the look on his face. He's like, is this going to make it? These are our latest and greatest technology going up on a action-packed rocket.
Yeah.
So the nerves are there and the excitement is there. And then once they get into orbit and everything starts to connect and we start to get the signals back and we were getting health checks, everybody can breathe a sigh of relief. And then we just get excited about, how much new and emerging information we're going to get from those new sensors.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. I was just super curious about what it was like in there. So looking at our time, I'm going to kind of take us more into that generalist space. We talked about Planet and what it does. Super cool. As I said, I know like so many forestry companies that are using Planet technology, and you shared some new things that are coming. So we'll be on the lookout for that. But thinking about 1, 3, 10-year timeframes, our listeners know I always ask this. What gets you excited? Like, are there things that you're kind of seeing coming that you're like, holy cow, it's like, this thing is just going to be a game changer in that 1, 3-year time, or maybe 10 years. But are there certain technologies that you'd want to share with our digital foresters in terms of, hey, keep your head up, just watch it. It might be far in the horizon. It might be in the short term. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm a remote sensing geek and an environmental monitoring and ecological science geek. So the thing that I get really excited about is seeing people use time series information to its fullest potential. Because you think of a satellite image traditionally, or aerial imagery, you're getting a snapshot in time. And we've already seen with area-based inventories, LiDAR inventories, adding spectral information to those analytics improves things like species classification and early detection of problems, and you can even track like regrowth and regeneration. But really, one snapshot a year, one snapshot every other year at very high resolution helps. But near daily information, and we're talking about not just Planet's constellation, but some of the work we're doing to fuse the information from our sensors with all of the other satellites out there. So that's synthetic aperture radar for
Cool.
cloud-proof imaging. It's the Sentinel-2 information. So, talking about 8 or more spectral bands. It's a series of advances in the space and Earth observation ecosystem, where we're able to merge and fuse all that data into a very clean signal on the temporal dynamics of forests and vegetation. And I think we're going to continue to see this trend of fusion and normalization and what we call harmonization between all of these sensors to get a really, really accurate gauge on what's going on the ground, with less and less need for ground validation and training data on the ground. Just the way it seems to be going is everyone in this forestry, carbon market, biomass world is still hinging on ground validation data.
All right.
You gotta train your model. It's got to be forest type specific. It's got to be regionally specific. Got to follow standards. That's going to be the way it goes for years and years until we get to a point where we can trust the models, because we know that the source data, the LiDAR and the satellite sensor information, is normalized and standardized in a way that it can work across all the different forest types, trained on these robust models that have come from multi-source integrations and standardizations, so that you will need less ground data to validate things. You'll basically say, I trust this information until something doesn't look right. For sure, let's go investigate that on the ground. But I'm excited to see the future of very high temporal coverage, near daily detection of changes, early detection of fires and fire risk. And I think that this is something that the remote sensing Earth observation world has talked about since the dawn of remote sensing science.
Absolutely.
That is finally coming to fruition through these fusion methodologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when I even think back to my grad days, those words were at play, right? And it's kind of funny that, you coming from the science side, like, is that the magic rule? Like, it takes 20 years for that science to commercialize and those ideas in the ivory towers to really kind of take shape and form and bring the people along for that change management journey. I don't know. I'm just finding a lot, as I look back in my career, a lot of things, that us and our ivory towers thought about is it seems to fit on that 20 year after not told you so, as opposed to, as it's harder to affect change and introduce new technologies to any sector, but forestry can be even more challenging. So thinking further out, 10 years out, give me that, I'm going to throw a dart with zero precision and accuracy. It's going to go somewhere. What's the world look like 10 years out for you?
Yeah, outside of the forestry piece alone, that's a tough question to answer. I don't see myself leaving the space industry. I really think it's an exciting space to be, no pun intended. I think the number of changes we're seeing in the technology capabilities, so exponential growth in the reduction of cost of getting hardware into orbit, and the types of things that we can measure. I can see myself staying in this new space age with a focus on forests, because forest is really my passion. And there's a lot of really cool things that can be done that I would like to see done with remote sensing technologies that help us better manage forests on a whole. So not just from a timber perspective, but also from, as I talked earlier, about the ecosystem service landscape and the natural capital of what forests offer humans and wildlife in general. So I'm excited about what's to come once we kind of figure out where this new technology really fits into the marketplace and what solutions have long-term value for helping us sustainably manage forests, and making sure that the folks that are working on the ground and managing the timber, the forestry companies are in sync with public interests on longevity of forestry. Canada's got an amazing track record for the forestry science, academic world and industry collaboration, and making sure that we've got 50, 100, 150 year plans for our forest management. And I'd like to see that technology spread more to nations that are just getting a good handle on correcting maybe some of the deforestation practices and making it more of a sustainable operation with their forests.
Yeah, for sure. And then you mentioned the words natural capital and ecosystem services. I'm just curious with like this influx of like climate tech funding from the climate tech, like it's almost like oh, I don't know. Would you agree it's exciting times because there's almost a different set of players coming from the VC world that's driving that EO space and maybe pushing things, accelerating things maybe beyond what us traditionally trained EO scientists would think. Do you think that's in the going in the right direction? And did that surprise you to see that flood of climate tech investment coming in?
I was a little surprised at the level of involvement that kind of emerged throughout the pandemic. I think, if you pay attention to the larger goals and initiatives of, global economic giants, there's been this desire to really accelerate clean technology. There's been a major push in funding green tech developments. So the timing obviously, happened around the same time as the pandemic, not by coincidence. People looked inwards for a time and thought, what kind of shifts can we make and should we make? And it just seemed like everything kind of came together to make that happen. And I think we're just going to see with this natural capital carbon market excitement, the traditional, hype curve that you see with new products and services come out and new
Yep.
technologies where it's like, we can do everything. No, we can't. And then you
Yep.
actually figure
Yep.
out where the value piece is and carry that forward. So in the longer term, 10 years out, we're going to see a lot of the foundations for forest management practices evolving over these next few years with the adoption of new technologies that can more remotely see all of the forest at once instead of just the areas that we're actively on the ground managing. And that'll be a long lasting effect, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Crossing the chasm is harder than most people think when we think about new technology and innovation. Final question from my side, I guess, is if you were to look back to a younger Cassidy, pre Dr. Cassidy Rankine, is there a piece of advice you'd give yourself, knowing what you know today and the journey? Is there something you'd share with the younger self?
I would probably tell myself not to worry about the little things that, as a researcher in my younger days, or even someone just very curious about science, is you're trained to look at the details, especially when you're doing like experiments. It's like, notice the little things, track those because they may be significant. And then when you come out of that research world and academic world and get into industry, you learn the little things are not as important when it comes to hiccups on the road. That's the same concept that we've been kind of coming back to, is fail often and fail fast and recover and learn from it. Is don't dwell on the little things that don't work. Just focus on what is working and pay attention to that.
Yeah, and that's great advice. And even for our digital foresters, as you look at adopting some new technologies in your digital transformations, that advice from Cassidy applies even there. Like, take that step forward and course correct as you go. So I suspect some of our listeners are going to, as we wind down, some of our listeners are probably thinking, hey, like, I want to learn more. I want to discover more and whatnot. What's the best way for folks to get a hold of you? I know you're very active in social, and that I say that in an awesome way. You're always sharing your thoughts and sharing other people's work, and that's awesome. We need folks like you to keep challenging promoting the discussion in different areas, and then challenging things that may not be quite accurate per se. But how do folks reach you? Twitter, LinkedIn, email? What's the best way?
I'd say LinkedIn's probably the most direct way to find me and get a hold of me. I will answer my emails as well, probably not as quickly, but that's just my name. It's cassidy.rankin@gmail. And I'm always open to the conversations around new technologies, forestry specific. I could talk your ear off probably at no length. And I'd love to connect with anyone that wants to talk more about, practices in forest management and specifically remote sensing tech.
Cool. Well, there you have it, Digital Forester listeners. If you want to reach out to Cassidy, LinkedIn, easiest way, ping him, Cassidy Rankine, or at his email address. So, hey, man, thanks so much for joining. I know, as I said, we started this podcast where we're just back to back. If you're like me, it's like another back to back. So, hey, if I can give you back a few minutes between the next one, that's probably beneficial. But I really appreciate your time sharing your ideas. This is one I really wanted to, one, not only catch up because it's been a few years since we actually spoke, and you've obviously moved, done lots of cool things. I've watched at afar. So definitely appreciate you carving out the time. Final thoughts to you, Cassidy.
I thank you for having me on here. I love what you're doing with this podcast. I've listened to the others, and there's some really incredible people that you've had attend this podcast and share their thoughts on the industry. I'd encourage people to listen to those as well. And Kevin, you've complimented me a whole bunch on this talk, but I'd say you're more modest than you need to be. You've got an impressive track record in bringing the industry forward into adopting things like LiDAR and more advanced geospatial technology. So it's a pleasure to chat with you as always, and thanks again.
For sure, absolutely. All right, well, take care and be safe, and I hope to see you on the circuit in person one of these days.
That's the plan.
All right, man. Okay, take care.